2:17 in the morning, February. The Ozark Hills are black and still. A pair of headlights cuts through the dark. Slow, deliberate, familiar in the worst way. The truck doesn't announce itself. It never does. It just comes. A woman stands at a farmhouse window. Thomas's flannel shirt. Cold coffee in her hand. She doesn't move. Outside, a bulldozer blade tilts. A cascade of pale sawdust pours down. Slow, almost gentle, onto land her grandfather's grandfather broke from rock and red clay 100 years ago. She has called every office, written every letter, hired the only lawyer in the county who would take her case, and one by one, every door closed, the pile grows. She watches, and somewhere behind her eyes, something shifts. Not defeat, not rage. Something quieter, something that takes a long time to name. She turns from the window, walks to the kitchen, reaches for a notebook on shelf above the refrigerator. Brown leather, worn soft. She hasn't opened it in 9 years. Tonight, she opens it. Have you ever watched someone destroy something your family spent generations building? Slowly, deliberately, and realized the law wasn't going to stop them? That's where Nora Calloway was standing. 2:17 in the morning, February. The kind of cold that gets into the walls of an old farmhouse and stays there. Makes itself comfortable like it owns the place. She was wearing Thomas's old flannel shirt over her pajamas, because she couldn't find her robe in the dark and hadn't wanted to turn the light on. Some instinct about staying invisible. She heard the truck before she saw it. That low diesel rumble she'd learned to hate the way you learn to hate a sound that wakes you up every single time. Her body knew it before her brain did, shoulders up, chest tight, feet already moving toward the window. The headlights were cutting across the east field, her east field, the good field. The one her father, Hank Sorrells, had spent 15 years coaxing out of red Ozark clay, hauling compost, adjusting pH, planting cover crops through winters when the ground froze hard as concrete, and most people would have given up and gone inside. The field where her husband Thomas had grown the sweetest corn she'd ever tasted, the summer before he died. The field that had fed her family, paid her bills, kept her on this land for 7 years since the accident. They were dumping at night now. That was new. For 3 years, Brent Sutherland's operation had come in daylight. His workers would pull up with the bulldozer in the morning, broad and obvious and utterly without shame, and push another load of mill waste onto her property like it was the most natural thing in the world. Sawdust, bark fragments, wood chips, the leftover material from 3 generations of Sutherland lumber, all the byproduct that had no commercial value and needed somewhere to go. Somewhere convenient, somewhere cheap, somewhere belonging to a widow who didn't have a lawyer on retainer. But she'd started photographing the daytime deliveries. Date-stamped pictures, every load, sent to Cliff Oaks at his office in Jasper, and filed in a manila folder, growing thicker by the month. So apparently the solution was to come at 2 in the morning, when a woman would presumably be asleep and not standing at her window in her dead husband's flannel shirt watching. She watched the truck backed up along the fence line. The bed tilted. A cascade of pale wood chips and sawdust spilled out in a long, slow pour, almost gentle-looking in the headlight beams. Like something being tucked in rather than discarded, Nora stood at the window until the truck was gone. Then she stood there a little longer. Then she went to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table with her hands flat on the wood surface, feeling the grain under her palms, trying to remember what her father used to say about patience. Something about how the land keeps score even when the courts don't. She got up and went to the shelf above the refrigerator. The notebook was there. Brown leather cover, soft and worn at the corners, the kind of soft that comes from decades of hands. Hank Sorrells had carried it in his back pocket every day for 30 years. There was a curve worn into the back cover from the shape of his pocket, a gentle arc she'd traced with her finger at his funeral and never opened the book since. 9 years ago, she put it on the table, sat back down, looked at it, didn't open it. Not yet. Nora had grown up on 30 acres in Harmon County, Arkansas, which was either the most beautiful place in the world or the most stubborn, depending on the season and your temperament. The Ozark foothills did not apologize for themselves. The soil was red clay with a mean streak. The winters were dry and the summers were brutal, and the land did not cooperate with people who approached it casually. You had to know it. Study it the way you'd study a difficult person, learn its moods and patterns, and the specific way it signaled when something was wrong. Hank Sorrells knew his land. He had started farming it at 24 with almost nothing. A beat-up tractor bought with inheritance money, a second-hand disc harrow, about $40 in his pocket. The house had been his grandfather's. The land had been his grandfather's grandfather's, passed down through a family that had never been wealthy, and made up for it with stubbornness. Hank used to say they were the kind of people the Ozarks made on purpose, shaped by the same difficult soil they farmed. He'd spent the first decade just figuring out what the land needed, not what a textbook said. What this particular piece of ground, with this particular clay content and this particular drainage pattern and its specific relationship with the creek along the southern border, actually needed. He'd composted everything. Kitchen scraps, fallen leaves, grass clippings, manure from the small livestock he kept alongside the vegetables. A few goats and chickens, nothing large, just enough to generate fertility and provide eggs and cheese for the family. He layered it all together and waited and watched and adjusted. By the time Nora was born, the east field had become something remarkable. Dark soil, almost black in patches, that grew vegetables so lush they looked slightly unreal. The tomatoes were extraordinary. The sweet corn was ridiculous. Neighbors used to drive by on the county road and slow down just to look. Hank taught Nora everything in the notebook and more. He taught it the way the Ozarks teach things. Through doing, not explaining. He'd hand her a shovel and point at a compost pile, and she'd learn by turning it wrong a dozen times before understanding the right way. He'd take a handful of soil and roll it between his fingers, and she'd watch his face, learning to read what his expression meant before she could read the soil itself. She married Thomas Calloway at 29. Thomas had been smart enough to understand. He'd also married the land and the knowledge that came with it. He wasn't a farmer by background. He'd grown up in Fort Smith. Understood machinery better than soil, but he was a willing student and a patient man, and they'd built something real together on those 30 acres over 17 years. A life that wasn't rich by most measures but was solid and honest and theirs. Then Thomas died. A Tuesday afternoon in October, nothing special about the day. He'd been servicing the tractor in the equipment shed. Something went wrong. By the time Nora found him, it was already over. The county coroner was a man named Delbert, who'd gone to high school with Thomas, and had a hard time meeting Nora's eyes when he filled out the paperwork. She was 45 years old with a farm to run and a daughter in college and no idea how you kept going when the person you'd built everything with was suddenly just gone. So she did what stubborn Ozark people do. She kept going. Because what else was there? Because Hank was buried in the family plot at the north end of the property, and Thomas was buried beside him now, and the land that held them both still needed tending. She managed. 7 years of managing. The farm kept her fed, kept her daughter Lee through the last 2 years of college, kept the property taxes paid. Not comfortable, not easy, but possible, until Brent Sutherland decided her east field was a convenient landfill. The Sutherland family had operated their sawmill on the adjacent property since 1967, when Brent's grandfather built the first processing shed. His father expanded it in the 80s. Brent inherited both the operation and the attitude that came with it. The comfortable certainty of a man whose family had been dominant in Harmonton County for 50 years and saw no reason that should change. Well, he wasn't evil exactly. That would have been simpler. Evil you could point to and name. Brent Sutherland was something more ordinary, and in some ways worse. A man who had always gotten what he wanted by waiting for smaller people to give up, and who'd never had reason to update that strategy. The dumping had started slowly. Nora hadn't noticed it at first. A small accumulation of mill waste along the fence line she'd assumed was windblown debris from the neighboring property. By the time she understood what was happening, there were already 18 inches of material piled along a 100-foot stretch of the fence. She called his office. Professional. Civil. His assistant told her Mr. Sutherland would look into it. He didn't. She called the county environmental office, a department housed in a beige building in Jasper that smelled like old carpet and institutional resignation. A man named Carl came out, looked at the pile, wrote something in a notebook, and told her someone would follow up. Someone did not follow up. She called the state agency, sent letters, sent registered letters, sent photographs. She'd been polite for 2 years because that was what reasonable people did. They followed the proper channels and trusted that the system would eventually respond to documented evidence. The proper channels had led her in a perfect circle back to where she'd started. Cliff Oaks ran a small general practice out of a 2-story building on Harmon County's main street, the kind of office that handled wills and real estate closings, and occasional disputes between neighbors, not the kind that went to war with 3-generation sawmill operations. Nora sat across from him on a Wednesday morning in March of 2012 and listened to him be as honest as a lawyer knows how to be. What it would cost to litigate was a number that made her stomach drop. $50,000 on the low end, he said, and that assumed a relatively clean path through the courts, which was not what you'd get when the other side had Durbin and Associates in Little Rock on retainer. More likely $70,000 over 3 to 4 years. Probably more. Nora had $3,800 in savings. She knew what Cliff wasn't saying directly, that Sutherland's lawyers had almost certainly done this math before the first load of sawdust ever crossed her fence line. They'd looked at her situation. Widow, single income, small operation, no legal resources, and determined that the cost of fighting would outlast her ability to fight. It wasn't personal. It was arithmetic. On her way home, she stopped at the county recorder's office and pulled the deed history on the Sutherland property. Found what she was looking for in the 1989 records. A family named Peterson had owned land on the other side of the Sutherland mill. They'd sold it 20 months after a series of property complaints began appearing in the county files. Sold it to a holding company that turned out, on further examination, to have been financed by Sutherland interests. This was not the first time. She sat in her truck in the parking lot for a long time after that. The afternoon was flat and gray, the kind of November sky that presses down on you. She thought about the Peterson family, wherever they'd gone. She thought about her father buried in the North Field, and Thomas buried beside him, and the 30 acres of difficult red clay. Their combined stubbornness had turned into something worth keeping. She thought about the fact that Brent Sutherland had done this before, and it had worked perfectly. Then she started the truck and drove home. The first time Sutherland came to talk to her directly, she'd been replacing a fence post along the south pasture, late October, the kind of clear autumn afternoon when the light in the Ozarks turns gold and the whole world looks like it's apologizing for the summer. She heard his truck before she saw it. Different rumble than the dump trucks. Smoother, newer, expensive. He was a large man, Brent Sutherland. Not fat, just built big. The kind of size that fills a doorway. Silver hair, well kept. He dressed like a man who wanted you to know he could afford to dress well but didn't want to seem like he was trying. He stood at the fence and told her he understood there'd been some concerns about material migration from his property. Material migration. Nora set down her post driver and looked at him. He told her he was willing to make things right, that he recognized the situation had been causing her inconvenience, that he wanted to be a good neighbor. Then he told her he'd pay $120,000 for the property, all 30 acres. Fair market value, maybe a little above, given the circumstances. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up her post driver and went back to work. He stood there a while longer, probably not used to being ignored. Then he said the offer would remain open and drove away. She didn't watch him go, but she thought about it that night and the night after. $120,000. She could buy something smaller, something manageable, something that didn't require fighting a man with unlimited patience and a legal team that billed by the 6-minute increment. She could leave, except that her father was buried in the North Field, except that Thomas was buried beside him. Except that she knew, with a certainty that didn't require deliberation, that if she left this land, she would lose something that could not be recovered, or replaced or approximated by buying something smaller somewhere else. Some things only exist in one place, and you either stay with them or you don't. She wrote Sutherland a letter declining the offer, short and formal, mailed it certified. His assistant called to confirm receipt and asked if she'd like to discuss alternative arrangements. Nora said no thank you and hung up. The dump trucks came more frequently after that, 3 times a week now instead of 1. More volume per load. As if he'd done a calculation after her refusal and adjusted the pressure accordingly. She photographed each delivery, dated every image, added them to Cliff's file, and understood with increasing clarity that the filing was not going to stop anything, that the evidence was accumulating in a folder that no one with actual power was reading, and that the legal path she'd been walking with such careful documentation was a path that went nowhere she could afford to follow. She knew this, and she kept filing anyway, because you don't stop doing the right thing just because the right thing isn't working yet. You keep the record, you make the evidence, you do not pretend the wrong thing isn't happening. But you start thinking about something else. November came in cold and damp, the way it does in the Arkansas hill country when autumn is genuinely over and winter is making its seriousness known. Nora had been planning to spend the morning documenting the latest accumulation of mill waste along the east fence line. Cliff had asked her to keep detailed measurements alongside the photographs, building the kind of file that might matter someday, even if today it went nowhere. She was pushing through the tall grass near the fence, mental map of the pile's dimensions in her head, when she tripped. The ground gave way under her left foot in a way she hadn't expected. Soft rather than hard, yielding rather than solid. And she went down sideways, one hand catching herself on the slope of the pile, the other plunging wrist-deep into the material. She stayed on her knees for a second, more surprised than hurt, and then she looked at her hands. The surface of the pile was the usual gray-brown of dried mill waste. But where her hand had punched through into the interior, the material clinging to her palm was different, darker, almost black, and it had a different texture entirely. Not the fibrous roughness of sawdust, but something that gave slightly when she pressed it, something almost fine. She brought her hand closer to her face. The smell hit her before her brain caught up. Not the smell of decay or the damp rot of something breaking down wrong. The smell of the forest floor after a soaking rain. The smell of something alive and working at its purpose. Complex and deep and unmistakably organic in the productive sense. The sense her father had meant when he used the word alive to describe soil that was doing what soil was supposed to do. She sat back on her heels in the damp grass and looked at the pile for a long time. It was composting, not efficiently, not with any management. But the basic biology was happening because it always happens, whether anyone intends it or not. The rain had soaked the pile through the fall. The summer heat before that had worked on it. The bacteria and fungi that live in every handful of organic material on Earth had moved in and started their patient, ancient work. The pile was not inert. It was in the process of becoming something else. Her father's voice, from somewhere in the 30 years of memory she carried. The land keeps score. She stood up slowly, looked at the pile, looked at the east field beyond it, looked at the distance between what the pile was now and what it could be. Then she walked back to the house, with one thought forming and reforming as she went, not yet complete enough to call a plan, but present enough that she couldn't put it down. But what nobody knew was that same evening, Nora sat at her kitchen table and opened her father's brown leather notebook for the first time since his funeral. The notebook had been on the shelf above the refrigerator for 9 years, and she had never been ready to open it, and never been ready to get rid of it. So it had stayed there, spine out, patient, the way things left by dead people tend to be patient. She sat at the kitchen table with it now. His handwriting was the handwriting of a man who'd stopped formal schooling at 6 and spent the rest of his life reading everything he could find. A self-educated precision, letters formed carefully, nothing wasted. He'd made entries over decades, updating what he learned, crossing out things that turned out to be wrong, adding marginal notes in different colored inks as the years passed. The notebook was not a finished document. It was a working record, still in progress when he died, still expecting to be added to. She turned pages slowly, soil pH testing, cover crop schedules, notes on weather patterns going back to 1971. A diagram of the drainage system along the creek boundary drawn in pencil, so precise it was almost architectural. Observations about the behavior of specific pests in specific years that formed a long-range pattern when you looked at them together. Then she found the section on compost. He'd written it in phases. Original entries in his careful hand, then additions, then revisions, then a long section that must have been written later when he had years of observation to draw on. At the top of the first compost page, underlined twice, "These are not instructions. This is what I have seen. You will see different things and you must trust what you see." She read the section on wood-based materials. Wood chips and sawdust are difficult. They are high in carbon and break down slowly alone. The key is nitrogen. Manure works best, chicken manure especially, mixed in layers. You need moisture but not wet. You need air. Turn often, more than you think necessary. You need heat. A pile that doesn't heat up is a pile that isn't working. In summer it will steam if you are doing it right. In winter be patient. The process does not stop. It only slows. And then, almost as an aside, the sentence she read 3 times before she put the notebook down. "This material that mills throw away. I have always thought it could be made into something. I never had enough of it to try at scale. The East Field would be different with black soil 3 feet deep." Her father had looked at mill waste and thought, potential. He'd written it in this notebook and put it on the shelf, and she'd put the notebook on the shelf after his funeral. And there it had sat for 9 years while Brent Sutherland had been delivering exactly what her father had imagined using. She sat with that for a long time. Outside, the November dark was total. The kind of rural dark that people who grow up with streetlights don't fully understand. Not dim but completely, absolutely black. The world reduced to what the porch light touched and nothing beyond. The refrigerator hummed. The house still somewhere above her. A small creak of old timber finding its position in the cold. She was not going to call Cliff Oaks again. That was done. She was not going to write another letter. Also done. She was not going to sell this land. That had never been a real possibility. Not honestly, no matter how sleepless the nights had been. What she was going to was this. She was going to make compost. Not because she was certain it would work. Not because she had a plan or resources or any particular confidence that what her father had imagined in theory would hold up at the scale she was facing. But because he had written the East Field would be different, and she had the waste, and she had the field, and she had his notebook telling her exactly how to start, and because there is a specific quality of anger that, in the right person under the right pressure, stops being anger and becomes something else entirely. Not resignation, not aggression, but a cold and quiet and almost geological determination to prove that what someone wanted to destroy was capable of things they had never imagined. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. She lay awake for a long time thinking about nitrogen and carbon ratios, turning schedules, moisture content, the way her father's face used to look when he was about to show her something that had worked. Then she thought, he sent more waste this week than last week. Good, she was going to need it. The winter was the longest she could remember, not in calendar terms. January through March, same as every year, the Ozarks going gray and hard frozen, and then slowly, reluctantly, loosening toward something that might eventually become spring. 47 days below freezing. 6 inches of snow in February that lasted 3 weeks. The creek along the south boundary iced over for the first time since 2008. Same winter as always. But she was outside in it every single day. The compost piles don't stop in winter. That was the thing people didn't understand. The thing the county extension bulletin addressed in careful academic language, and Hank's notebook addressed more plainly. Cold slows the biology but does not halt it. The organisms doing the work don't die. They slow. They wait. And if you maintain the pile correctly, if you keep the moisture right and turn it enough to prevent the interior from freezing solid, they keep converting, just at a pace that requires patience rather than attention. She had both. She didn't tell anyone she was starting. Not Lee, who called every Sunday from Tulsa and would have had thoughts about it that Nora wasn't ready to hear. Not Vera Dunstan next door, 70 years old and sharp enough to notice and ask questions. Not Cliff Oakes, who would have been cautious in a sensible, lawyerly way that would have made her cautious too. She just started. January. Cold. The East Field was a misery of frozen mud under the mill waste accumulation. And the mornings were dark until almost 8. She identified a section of the pile along the south end that had been accumulating the longest. Material from the first years of dumping that had already partially broken down naturally. She designated that as her first working area and began. The shovel she used had been her father's. She knew this because his initials were stamped into the handle, HS, the same small stamp he'd used on the notebook cover. It was a good shovel, heavy, balanced, blade still sharp from the last time Thomas had maintained the equipment shed tools. She thought of Thomas every time she drove it into the pile, which was not always comfortable, but also not something she would have changed. She built the first compost pile 15 feet from the existing waste accumulation, in a spot where the drainage was good, and the morning sun hit it longest. She layered according to the notebook, wood waste first, then goat manure from the small herd she kept, then leaf litter raked from the tree line, then another layer of wood waste, then manure again. She watered it down until it was damp but not saturated, exactly as the notebook described. She covered the sides with old burlap feed sacks to hold moisture. Then she turned it, 3 times a week every time, without exception. Push the outer material to the center material to the outside, introduce air throughout. Hank had written that most compost piles fail because people don't turn them often enough, and the material at the edges never reaches decomposition temperature. She set a reminder on the kitchen timer and treated it like an appointment she couldn't miss. The first weeks were discouraging in the way that all patient work is discouraging at the start, which is that nothing visible happened. The pile sat there. It looked like a pile of damp wood chips and manure, because that was exactly what it was. The cold didn't help. January in the Ozarks is not prime composting season, and she knew this, and had factored it into her expectations based on the notebook's guidance about slower winter decomposition. But knowing a thing and watching an unchanging pile day after day are different experiences. One lives in the head, the other lives in the body. She'd push the fork in, turn the material, step back, look, still a pile. Some mornings she stood there longer than she needed to, just looking. Asking the pile a question she couldn't quite articulate, wondering whether her father's notes had been theoretical. Observations from small experiments, not from doing what she was attempting, which was converting thousands of cubic feet of industrial mill waste into viable farmland without machinery, without capital, without anyone helping her. There was a morning in mid-February, when she stood there in the gray pre-dawn cold and thought, with a clarity that was almost peaceful, maybe I'm just a stubborn old woman talking to a heap of garbage. She let herself think it fully, turned it over, examined it. Then she picked up the fork and kept going. Vera Dunstan noticed. Of course she did. Vera had been on the adjacent property for 30 years, and had developed the observational habits of a woman who had spent that time paying careful attention to everything around her. She was the kind of neighbor who knew what was different on your property before you'd fully registered it yourself. Not from toesiness, but from the agricultural attentiveness of someone whose own livelihood depended on reading the landscape accurately. She didn't say anything for weeks. Just occasionally appeared at the fence line in the early morning when Nora was working, stood there a few minutes, watched, went back to her own property. No comment, no question, no expression that communicated anything beyond the neutral attention of a person doing an honest assessment. Then one morning Nora found a burlap sack by the gate. Heavy, knotted at the top. She opened it. Cow manure, dried and partially composted already. The good kind that was mostly broken down and would add nitrogen without burning. No note, no explanation. Just the sack, left before dawn while Nora was still inside. Nora stood in the cold, holding the bag, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to calculate. The particular warmth of being seen without being required to explain yourself. Of someone understanding what you were doing and deciding, without discussion, to contribute to it. She didn't go knock on Vera's door and express gratitude. That wasn't how things worked between people who'd been farming next to each other for decades. Instead, she incorporated the manure into the next turning, which was the correct response, the one that honored what the gift actually was. And she added a second burlap bag to her mental list of supplies to pick up in town, because this was going to be a long process. And she had no intention of being proud about accepting good nitrogen when it was offered. February passed. March arrived with the typical Ozark grudgingness. Not a clean arrival, but a negotiation. Warm days interrupted by cold snaps. The ground thawing and refreezing in a cycle that tried your patience if you were working in it every day. Nora worked in it every day. She was turning pile 1 on a morning in mid-March when she pushed the fork in and pulled it back out, and the steam hit her face. Real steam. Not mist, not condensation. The heat of active decomposition, the biological process running at full speed, microorganisms converting carbon and nitrogen at a temperature that was measurably, physically, undeniably hot. She stood there with the steam rising around her hands in the cold air, and felt something move through her chest that she didn't immediately name. She pushed the fork in again, slower this time, and turned a section deliberately and watched the steam billow up from the disturbed interior. The smell was different from what it had been in November. Still organic, still complex, but warmer somehow, richer, with a depth that the early pile hadn't possessed. She pulled a handful of material from the center and brought it close. It was warm against her cold cheeks. She squeezed it. It didn't crumble like dry sawdust. It held its form briefly, then broke apart in her palm, with the texture of something that had been through a process and arrived somewhere new. The color was darker than the material at the edges. Not black yet, not the finished product, but moving toward it the way the sky moves toward dawn. Unmistakably on its way. She stood in the cold March morning with steam on her hands, and thought about her father writing in his notebook on some quiet evening. I have always thought it could be made into something. She was not a person who cried easily. She had not cried at Thomas's funeral, where people could see her. Not until she was alone, in the barn later, with the door shut. She had not cried at Hank's either. She believed in processing things privately and presenting the world with a functional face. But standing here in this field with steam rising from her palms, something passed through her that was too large to hold quietly. Grief and proof, and the specific ache of wishing someone were alive to see a thing, all arriving at once in the cold March air of a field in Arkansas, that was about to become something neither her enemies nor she herself had fully imagined yet. She put the handful of material back into the pile, picked up the fork, and went back to work. Lee arrived in June with her car and her worry, and the particular compressed energy of a person who has been monitoring a situation from a distance and has finally decided that proximity is required. She drove in on a Friday afternoon, got out, and looked at her mother with the specific assessment that adult children perform on parents they're concerned about. Checking weight, checking color, checking the eyes for the particular flatness that signals a person running on not enough of everything. Her voice was careful when she finally spoke. "You've lost weight. I've been working more." "That's not reassuring, Mom." Nora took her bag. "I made a casserole. Come inside." They ate and talked about Lee's work in Tulsa, and about the property taxes, and about the neighbor 3 miles up the road who'd had a barn fire in April. Nora watched her daughter eat, and noticed how much she looked like Thomas when she was thinking about something. The same slight narrowing around the eyes, the same quality of attention that wasn't quite worry, and wasn't quite analysis, but somewhere between the two. After dinner, in the long summer dusk when the Ozark light goes gold, and then pink before the dark, they walked the property the way they'd always done since Lee was small. It was a habit from childhood, the evening walk, Nora's method of staying connected to what the land was doing. They walked the creek boundary and the south pasture and the equipment shed, And then, inevitably, toward the east, the piles were unmistakable, not one pile. 4 now, each at a different stage of the process, with the turning marks visible in the surface material and the burlap moisture covers on the newest 2. And behind them, enormous and ongoing, the accumulated waste along the fence line that was still receiving deliveries 3 times a week. Leigh stopped walking. She looked at the organized piles. She looked at the fence line accumulation. She looked at her mother. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since January. You didn't tell me. I didn't know if it was going to be anything yet." Leigh walked to pile 1 and crouched up. She pushed her fingers into the outer edge, pulled out a handful, and turned it in the fading light. She was quiet for a moment, really quiet, the way people are quiet when they're not just thinking but actually absorbing something. Then she said, "This is almost soil, getting there, Mom." She stood up, and her voice had shifted. The worry still present, but something else alongside it now, something that hadn't been there when she arrived. "This is remarkable. It's compost. Your grandfather composted everything. Your grandfather didn't have 14,000 cubic feet of raw material delivered for free." Nora almost smiled. Leigh held the handful of dark material up and smelled it. The same instinctive gesture Nora had made in November, bringing something to your face to understand it better. She watched her daughter's expression change as the smell reached her. Not the smell of rot or waste or anything that should make a person go quiet. Something else. Something alive and old and working. "Smells like the forest," Leigh said. Not a description. Almost a question, like the East Field used to smell. Before, Leigh lowered her hand. They stood there together in the summer evening, the faint warmth of decomposition around them, the piles breathing slightly in the cooling air. "He doesn't know you're doing this?" Not a question. "No. You want him to keep dumping. I want him to keep delivering raw material." "Yes." Leigh looked at her mother with an expression that was several things at once, admiration and worry, and something that was either amusement or incredulity. It was genuinely hard to tell. Then she said, "Mom, that is either the smartest thing I've ever heard or completely insane." "Probably both," Nora said. "Come help me cover pile 2 before dark." Leigh set down her cup, walked to where the burlap covers were stacked, and started spreading the material without further comment. And Nora noticed. Not dramatically, not with the kind of internal announcement that the moment deserved, that her daughter had just chosen to help without being asked, without it being explained to her, without it being the reasonable or practical choice for a graphic designer from Tulsa who had driven down to check on her mother and could have been sitting on the porch instead. She noticed it, kept off twerking. Said nothing, but she noticed it. Summer continued. Nora expanded to 4 piles in July, 5 in August. The east fence line was providing more material than she could process immediately. Sutherland's increased delivery schedule had become exactly what she'd calculated, a supply chain operating at his expense for her benefit. She worked a system now. Fresh material from the fence line into new piles. Mid-stage piles turned and monitored. Pile 1 approaching completion, its interior consistently dark and fine-textured, its smell the forest floor depth the notebook had described as the target. She started planning the test plot. 3/4 of an acre at the south end of the east field, the section that had been covered by the earliest deposited wastes, and was therefore furthest along, in natural decomposition, beneath what she'd been managing. She would spread the first finished compost there in fall, let it incorporate through the winter, and plant in spring of 2014. She told no one. She wasn't ready for anyone's expectations or doubts to live in the project alongside her own. On an evening in late August, turning pile 4 in the heat that hadn't broken even at 7 o'clock, she heard Sutherland's truck. Not a dump truck, his personal vehicle, the expensive one. She heard it slow at the road, idle for a moment, then continue on. She didn't look up, she kept turning, whatever he'd seen. The organized piles, the systematic layout, the evidence that something deliberate was happening on land he'd planned to overwhelm. She didn't know, didn't matter. She wasn't operating on his timeline anymore. She was operating on the timeline of decomposition, which answered to biology and season and her father's accumulated knowledge. And none of those things had any interest in what Brent Sutherland thought about them. Leigh called on Sunday the way she always did. Nora told her about the fifth pile, about the test plot plan, about pile 1 looking close. How close? Leigh asked. Maybe 2 more months, and then you plant in spring. Let it incorporate through winter first. A pause. Then, Mom, I looked up wood waste composting. There's a paper from Cornell about carbon to nitrogen ratios in lumber mill byproduct composting that basically describes what you're doing. Your grandfather wrote the important parts 30 years ago. I know. I'm just saying the science agrees with him. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then, did it say anything about timeline? 18 to 24 months for complete transformation under optimal conditions. You're about 15 months in from when the oldest material was deposited? Spring then, if the data holds. The data, Nora repeated, with a slight inflection that contained 30 years of her father's empirical skepticism without being unkind about it. I know, Les said, and Nora could hear the smile. You'll see what you see. But it's good to know the science agrees with Grandpa. After she hung up, Nora sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open to the wood waste section. She read the entry one more time. Then she read the line she'd been reading every few weeks since November. The east field would be different with black soil 3 feet deep. Not 3 feet yet. Not even close to 3 feet. But the direction was right, and the process was running, and the material was still being delivered 3 times a week. By a man who thought he was winning. She closed the notebook, went to bed. Slept better than she had in months. December 30th. New Year's Eve approaching. Temperature at 19 degrees. Nora was turning pile 1, with her breath coming out in visible puffs, and her fingers going numb inside work gloves that had seen better years. And when she pulled the fork out of the center and the material fell back into the pile, the color stopped her, unmistakable now. Not almost dark, not moving toward black. Black. The genuine deep black of finished compost, of transformed material, of something that had completed a process and arrived at its destination. She stopped turning, took off one glove, pushed her bare hand into the center material warm. Not room temperature warm. Biologically warm. The warmth of a living system generating its own heat below the frozen surface. She held her hand there for a moment with the December air on her face and the warmth against her palm, and she thought about her father pressing his palm flat against garden beds in early spring to test whether the soil had warmed enough for planting. The same gesture, the same information gathering, the same quiet conversation with the ground conducted across decades and through death and through everything that had happened to this land in the years since he'd been here to tend it himself. She pulled her hand out, looked at it, black to the wrist, good black, earth black. She put her glove back on, went to get the wheelbarrow. She spread the finished compost on the test plot through January, wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, back and forth across the frozen ground. 6 inches of finished material turned into the existing soil. The work was slow and cold, and her back announced its objections by the second day. She worked through the objections, because there was no one else to do it, and the objections would still be there whether she worked or not. She thought about Thomas while she worked, not with grief exactly. 7 years had converted grief into something more like presence. The way a person you've loved becomes part of the background of everything rather than a foreground absence. She talked to him sometimes, out in the fields, told him about the compost. She thought he would have found the whole situation darkly funny. Sutherland trying to bury her composting his burial material. Thomas had possessed a dry appreciation for irony that had been one of the things she'd loved most about him. By the end of January, the test plot was ready. She covered it with straw mulch to protect the surface through the remaining winter, and added a border of small stakes with string, so she'd know exactly where the treated area ended and the untreated field began. Then she waited. Farmers are professionals at waiting. But this kind of waiting was different. Waiting with a specific hope attached, which is harder than waiting without one, because there is something real to lose if it doesn't work. March. The ground softened. Not dramatically, the Ozarks thaw in stages, the top 2 inches first while the deeper soil stays locked, and there's a transitional mud that forms in that phase that gets into everything and sticks to boot soles and has no useful properties whatsoever. She was out in it every day anyway. She took her first formal samples from the test plot in mid-March, working across the treated area with a soil probe she'd ordered from an agricultural supply catalog in January. She pulled cores from 6 locations across the test plot and from 3 locations in the adjacent untreated section and laid them side by side on the tailgate of the truck. The difference was visible to the naked eye. Test plot samples, dark, structured, with visible texture and a smell that was organic and complex, and alive in the way that good soil is alive. Untreated field samples, the familiar Ozark red clay, dense and mineral and honest about its limitations. She photographed everything, dated the photographs, added them to the documentation file, not for legal purposes anymore, but because her father had said that farming without records was faith, and farming with records was science, and you needed both, but you should always know which one you were using. She planted the test plot the last week of April, not the full range of what she'd eventually put in the east field. Just what she knew best, the crops she understood well enough to interpret the results accurately. Squash, pole beans, tomatoes. A row of sweet corn along the east edge, the same variety her father had grown, seed she'd saved from the last good harvest before the dumping had begun to affect the field's performance. She didn't tell anyone she was planting, she just planted. May was warm and the rains were good. She watered by hand in the dry spells, because it put her in the field every day and let her see what was happening at ground level. She watched the seedlings come up, watched them establish, watched the difference in their color and vigor, compared to what she was growing on the west side of the property in conventionally managed soil. The difference was not subtle. By the end of May, the test plot plants were a week ahead of the same varieties growing in the west field. The leaves were darker green. The stems were thicker at the base. The tomato plants were setting fruit faster than anything she could remember. Growing in 30 years of farming this land, she stood at the edge of the test plot one evening in early June and just looked. What had been a garbage pile, what Sutherland had intended as an unbearable burden that would force her hand, was producing the most vital plant growth she'd seen on this property in her lifetime. She felt many things in that moment and said none of them out loud. She went inside and wrote in the margin of her father's notebook, next to the entry about wood waste potential, in her own handwriting alongside his. He was right. It works. Then she closed the notebook, set it back on the table, and began planning how much more of the east field she could convert before the end of summer. Sutherland's trucks were still coming 3 times a week. She was going to need every load. Walt Brieger ran 40 acres about 4 miles north of Nora's property and had been farming Harmon County his entire life. 55 years old, built like someone who'd been doing physical work outdoors since he was 12, which he had, with a weathered face and a manner that was direct to the point of occasionally seeming blunt, until you spent enough time with him to recognize that he calibrated his words carefully and said exactly what he meant without decoration. He had a table at the Harmon County Farmers Market every Saturday, the same spot he'd occupied for 22 years, selling hay and seasonal vegetables, and the excellent hard cider he'd been making, since he figured out his apple trees were more reliable than his corn. He and Nora had been market neighbors long enough to have a relationship built on proximity and mutual respect, and the occasional exchange of information that farmers trade like currency. What's working this season, what isn't, what the weather looks like for the next 2 weeks, based on the behavior of things that don't appear in official forecasts. He noticed her produce before she said anything to him. She'd started bringing the test plot vegetables to market in July of 2014, just to see, just to understand what people responded to. The squash was enormous, genuinely, disproportionately large, the kind of size that suggests something unusual about the growing conditions rather than just a good variety or a lucky week. The tomatoes had the deep saturated color that comes from plants that haven't been stressed. that have had every resource available in the soil, without competition or deficiency. The pole beans were uniform and dense, in a way that market regulars recognized as different, even if they couldn't have said exactly why. Walt came around her table on a Saturday morning in mid-July and stood there looking at the tomatoes with the face of a person doing a professional assessment. He picked one up, held it, set it down. The silence was not empty. It was the silence of someone running numbers, someone who had been farming long enough to know that produce this good doesn't happen by accident, and wants to understand the specific accident that produced it. His voice was even when he finally spoke. Nora, what did you do to your soil? Composted. With what? Wood waste. Mill byproduct. Layered with manure and leaf litter, high-frequency turning, 18 months minimum before application. He was quiet a moment. Whose mill waste? She looked at him steadily. Sutherland's. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, he knew the broad outlines of the situation. Most farmers in the county did. But a rapid recalibration. The expression of a person processing newest information that reorganizes what they thought they understood. He looked at the tomatoes again and then back at her. You turned his dumping into this. I turned it into compost and the compost turned into this. He picked up one of the tomatoes and bit into it, standing there at her market table, which was not something you typically did before purchasing. She knew it wasn't impulsiveness, it was data collection. He chewed, swallowed, said nothing for a moment. Then, that's the best tomato I've eaten since my mother grew them. The soil makes the difference. I want to see how you did it. Not a question, not a request. A statement of intention from a man who had decided something and was simply informing her of it. Come to the property, she said. Saturday after next. Bring work clothes. He came. He arrived with his truck and his work clothes and a thermos of coffee, and the same quality of professional attention he'd worn at the market table. She walked him through the operation. The processing stages from fresh waste to finished compost, the turning schedule and the reasoning behind it, the moisture management, the layering ratios she'd worked out from Hank's notebook and refined through 18 months of observation and adjustment. She showed him the notebook itself, handed it to him without explanation, and watched him read the way she'd read it. Slowly, going back to certain passages, running his thumb along the edge of the page. At the test plot, he crouched and pushed his fingers into the soil, feeling the texture, checking the moisture, reading it with his hands the way experienced farmers read things before they read anything with their eyes. He stayed crouched for a long moment, then he stood. How much of the east field can you convert? All of it, eventually. I have more raw material than I can process at once. Years probably, and he keeps delivering. He hasn't stopped. Walt looked at the field. Then at the fence line where the latest accumulation waited. Then back at the field with its dark organized beds, and the production area already proving what the soil could do. He's funding your entire operation without knowing it, he said. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? She considered for a moment. He's giving back what he took. He just doesn't know that's what he's doing. Walt was quiet after that. He walked the test plot boundary, examined the plants, checked the adjacent untreated sections with the methodical thoroughness of a man comparing data points. Then he stood at the fence line and looked at the pile of fresh waste. Sutherland's trucks had left earlier that week. I want to learn this, he said. My north section has been underperforming for 4 years. I've been blaming the variety and the weather, and I think I've been wrong about both. It won't be quick, I know that. The notebook isn't transferable directly. You'll have to learn what it means for your specific land. I understand that too. A pause. I'm not asking you to sell me anything. I'm asking you to show me. She nodded. Then come back. Bring a fork. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. He learned the way she'd learned. By doing, by watching, by asking questions and sitting with the answers and returning to the pile. He was a good student in the way that experienced people are good students. He didn't pretend to know things he didn't, and he didn't resist revising what he thought he knew when the evidence suggested revision. And he started talking. Not to Nora about the method. He respected her enough not to overstep. but to other farmers in the county, in the casual way that agricultural knowledge has always spread through farming communities, person to person, at market tables and equipment dealers, and the feed store on Route 12. He didn't describe it as a program or a system. He just said what he'd seen, that Nora Calloway was doing something with her East Field that they should probably come look at. By September of 2015, she had visitors on 3 out of 4 Saturdays, farmers mostly. A few people she knew well, a few by sight, 1 or 2 who'd come from counties over based on something Walt had mentioned. She walked each of them through what she was doing, answered questions, made no promises about outcomes on their specific properties, because she understood that what worked on her land worked because of the specific conditions of her land. And honest knowledge transmission was never guarantee. It was method. She handed Hank's notebook to each person who came. Let them read the original entries in his handwriting. She'd come to believe that his voice carried something hers didn't. The authority of long observation, the tone of a man who'd made mistakes and recorded them honestly alongside the things that had worked. Reading it, people understood something about the knowledge that her explanation alone couldn't convey. This was not theory. It was the accumulated record of a specific life lived in close contact with specific ground. She never charged anyone. Not for her time, not for access to the property, not for the knowledge. A few people offered. She declined each time without negotiation, without elaboration beyond what was obvious. Walt pressed her gently on it one evening. You could at least cover your time. If I charge for it, it becomes a service. Services have standards and schedules and deliverables. What I'm teaching is a practice. Practices don't have a price, because the price would be the wrong frame for what's being exchanged. He looked at her with the expression he got when he disagreed with something, but recognized he wasn't going to change it. He didn't push further. Martha Covington ran the only dedicated kitchen store in Jasper, a narrow shop on the main street that sold good cookware and local specialty foods. She'd tasted Nora's tomatoes at the market and appeared at the property on an August morning, with the directness of a woman who ran a small business and didn't waste time on approach. She sat at the kitchen table. I want to offer your tomatoes and squash as featured produce. In store, with your name on the label. 15% above what you're getting at market. How did you find the property? Walt Brieger, of course. I can supply through September, Nora said. Maybe October if the weather holds. More next season? I'm expanding the composted area. More production next year. Then I'd like a standing arrangement. They shook hands and Martha drove back to Jasper. Nora sat at the kitchen table after she left and thought about what it meant that her farm income, which had been declining since the dumping began, the East Field's productivity steadily buried under accumulation, was now not just recovering but growing past where it had been. The thing Sutherland had been using to destroy her was making her stronger, not by accident, by design. His design and her use of it. She thought about that until she was sure she'd understood it correctly. Then she went outside because Pile 9 needed turning before dark. He came on a Tuesday in late August of 2015. She heard the expensive truck on the road and knew before she looked who it was. She was in the Eastfield, fork in hand, turning the morning pile. She kept working. He stood at the fence. She could feel him standing there before she heard anything. The weight of his presence, the specific attention of a man who had decided to do something and was now doing it. She kept her pace, kept her eyes on the material in front of her, made him wait the way he'd made her wait for 8 years. His voice when it came was not angry, almost wondering, the tone of someone whose arithmetic has produced a result he didn't expect. You've been using my waste, she kept turning. You've been dumping it on my land for 8 years. The silence that followed was full of calculation. She could hear him reassessing, running back through the numbers that had made such clean sense from his side of the fence line, and were now producing something he hadn't anticipated and couldn't account for with the tools he'd always used. I want to buy the formula. The businessman's voice now, the offer-making register, the tone that had probably closed 100 transactions in Harmon County conference rooms. What you're doing here? I want to sell compost. bagged, branded, regional market. I'll pay you 50,000 for the method. She stopped turning, not because the offer required it. She'd known something like this was coming, had run the conversation in her head at night, the way you rehearse things you know are approaching. She stopped because she wanted to be looking at him when she answered. She looked at him, a man in his early 60s who had spent 40 years getting what he wanted by outlasting smaller people, standing at a fence looking at something he hadn't anticipated and couldn't fully account for, trying to resolve it the only way he knew how, with a number and a clean transaction that would make the inconvenient thing his property, and therefore his to control. No, she said it without heat. Simple and complete as a door closing. 60,000, no. His jaw shifted slightly. $80,000 was significant money for a woman in your position. The phrase landed the way he'd intended. As a reminder of the differential, the resources on his side, the vulnerability on hers. The kind of reminder that didn't need to be a threat because the implication carried itself as without one. You should go, she said. Her voice stayed level. More level than she felt, but she'd had years of practice at that particular gap between interior and exterior. And you should think about whether you want to keep delivering material, because I've got 4 more beds to fill before winter, and your waste is better than anything I could source otherwise. He stood at the fence a moment longer. Something moved across his face. Not rage, not embarrassment, something more complicated. The expression of a man who has just understood that he's playing a game with someone who is never playing the same game back, who took everything he sent as weaponry and turned it into something he couldn't buy. He turned and walked to his truck without another word. She watched him go. Then she picked up her fork because the pile was not going to turn itself, and the day was getting on, and there was work to do that had nothing to do with Brent Sutherland. That night Lee called on a Tuesday, which meant she'd heard something. Walt Brieger called me, she said without preamble. He said Sutherland came to the property. He offered to buy the method. How much? Ended at 80,000, a sharp silence. Then, Mom, no, I'm not saying you should have said yes. I'm asking you to help me understand. She thought about how to say the true thing without making it sound smaller than it was. The practical reasons were almost too easy to list. The method wasn't transferable as a product. He couldn't reproduce the patience it required. The money would come with conditions she didn't want. All of that was true, and none of it was the real answer. The real answer. If she took his money, the knowledge became his acquisition. And the knowledge had started with her father, writing in a notebook on quiet evenings. And it had continued through her hands in the cold. And it had grown through every person who'd come to the property on a Saturday morning and learned something they took back to their own land. That wasn't a product. That was a living thing that grew by being shared freely. And Brent Sutherland's money would change what it was the moment it touched it. If I take his money, the knowledge becomes his transaction, she said. Your grandfather spent 40 years earning what's in that notebook. It deserves better than being sold to the man who tried to bury it. Leigh was quiet for a long time. Then, okay, Mom. I get it. A pause, and something in her voice had shifted. Not just acceptance, but something moving toward understanding. He's going to try something else, probably. And you're going to keep going. I'm going to turn pile 10 in the morning, Nora said. Yes. Sutherland tried to replicate what she was doing. She'd expected this. Expected it with a specificity that was almost prediction. The sequence of events. The particular way a man like him would approach a problem he understood as technical, rather than philosophical, the exact point where his implementation would fail. He hired a consultant from Fort Smith, who specialized in industrial composting operations. Invested in a professional windrow turner that cost more than Nora's truck. Set up a processing area on the back section of his property, and began composting the mill waste he could no longer afford to dispose of cheaply. Given the increased scrutiny his operation was starting to attract. She knew about this because Walt knew about it, and Walt knew because county knowledge traveled efficiently through people who paid attention and talked honestly to each other. She also knew, Before she heard that it had failed, exactly how it would fail, he was approaching the biology the way he approached the mill, as a production problem. Fixed ratios, fixed turning intervals, fixed temperature targets, a protocol designed for standardized input operated by people following instructions rather than reading the material. He'd given the consultant a deadline, and the consultant had given him a process. And the process was not wrong in theory but wrong in application, because compost is not a production line. Every batch of material is different. Every season changes what the biology needs. The pile communicates through the same signals it always uses. Temperature, smell, color when you fork it open, the specific resistance of the material against the tines. And if you're following a protocol instead of reading those signals, the protocol will be right enough of the time to be misleading and catastrophically wrong at precisely the wrong moments. By spring of 2016, Sutherland's operation had produced 2 batches that had gone anaerobic. The wrong kind of decomposition, the kind that smells like rot rather than forest floor, the kind that signals too little air, and the wrong organisms doing the wrong work in the wrong direction. His consultant revised the protocol twice. The 3rd batch was more consistent but still commercially unusable. He was spending significant money on equipment and labor, and producing results that were, by any honest comparison, a failure. She didn't say anything about it to anyone. Not to Walt, not at the Saturday sessions, not to Lee on their weekly calls. It wasn't satisfaction she wanted, and she'd been careful about that distinction for years. She'd wanted her own success, not his failure. And those were different orientations that produced different people over time. She'd worked to stay on the right side of that line, but she was human, and he'd tried to bury her land and her livelihood, and her father's work and her husband's memory all at once, for years, with patience and legal cover, and the comfortable certainty of someone who'd done it before and watched people break under it. So, she permitted herself one evening on the porch, in the warm spring dark, a glass of iced tea getting warm in her hand, to be quietly and briefly and entirely glad that some things cannot be bought or scheduled or outsourced to a consultant from Fort Smith. One evening. Then she went back inside. Cliff Oaks called in March of 2017 with the kind of informational mention that bars make when they want you to know something without making it a formal conversation. The lumber market had been contracting for 18 months. A competitor in Newton County with newer equipment was undercutting Sutherland on price. 2 major customers gone. And the environmental compliance costs were increasing. Not because of anything Nora had done specifically, but because a statewide review of industrial waste disposal practices had tightened the standards for the category Sutherland's operation fell into. They're also on a list for formal review, Cliff added, State Environmental Agency. Based partly on the regional study that cited your documented case. Nora was quiet a moment. What does formal review mean practically? It means someone is finally reading the file, Cliff said. The years of documentation, the photographs, the registered letters. Someone read them. She thought about the 8 years of certified letters that had produced no visible response. The manila folders growing thicker in Cliff's office. The registered mail confirmations she'd kept in a separate envelope, because that felt like the right level of care for documents, representing years of trying to make the right people pay attention. The system had been slow. Genuinely, frustratingly, almost unbearably slow. But it had not been entirely deaf. Keep the file current, she said. And thank you, Cliff. She hung up and sat for a while thinking about the Peterson family. The people who'd sold their land 20 months after Sutherland started the same campaign against them, back in 1989. She'd never found out where they'd gone or how they were. She thought about them sometimes, in the way you think about people whose story you know the first chapter of but not the rest. She hoped they'd landed somewhere good. She hoped they knew, wherever they were, that the strategy hadn't worked every time. The documentary filmmaker came in the spring of 2018. Her name was Bree Callender. From a small production company in Fayetteville that made short documentary films about agriculture and land and the stories that emerged from the intersection of the two. She'd been given a grant to document regional soil rehabilitation projects. Garrett, the high school biology teacher who'd attended Saturday sessions and become increasingly engaged with the project, had given her Nora's name. Deirdre from the extension office had given her the soil data. She'd called Nora on a Wednesday afternoon, with the specific combination of professional confidence and genuine curiosity that distinguishes good documentary filmmakers from people who are just pointing cameras at things. Nora had reservations. She'd spent years working quietly, by preference, without needing anyone outside the county to know about it. She thought about the pile at 2 a.m, and the Peterson family records, and the years of standing in the cold turning material that showed no visible results. None of that had required an audience. But she thought about Hank's notebook sitting on a shelf for 9 years. She thought about what her father had understood and written down, and what had happened to that understanding while it was shelved. Nothing. It had done nothing for anyone, and she thought about what had happened to it once she'd taken it down and used it, and started walking people through it on Saturday mornings. It had grown. It had moved. It had produced results on 31 farms across 4 counties that hadn't existed before. Knowledge on a shelf doesn't help anyone. She'd learned that the hard way. She told Bree she'd think about it. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she called back and said yes, with conditions. The timeline had to be honest, the difficulty had to be shown, the patience had to be in there and not cut for pacing. Bree said she could work with that. She came in May with a small crew, herself and a camera operator named James, who barely spoke and had an eye for detail that Nora noticed immediately in the way he kept framing things at ground level, finding angles that showed the texture of the soil rather than the broad overview. That was the right instinct. The story was in the texture. The story was always in what you had to get close to see. They filmed for 4 days. The piles, the turning, the Saturday session, the before and after documentation, the soil report beside the notebook page. They filmed Nora in the field at early morning when the light was flat and cold and honest. They filmed Walt talking about what he'd seen and what he'd changed and what his north section produced now compared to 4 years ago. They filmed Vera Dunstan, still the same, still watching from fence lines, still leaving things without notes, talking about what it had been like to watch the East Field transform from the adjacent property over 7 years. It was the most Vera had said in front of anyone in the county in years, and she said it with the directness of a person who had been observing carefully and was ready to report. On the last day of filming, Bree asked Nora to stand at the edge of the completed East Field and talk about what it meant. Nora stood there for a moment before speaking, thinking about how to say the true thing without making it sound like something printed on a kitchen wall. She looked at the field, 12 acres of deep, dark soil, the spring planting coming up strong and uniform. What had been ruined now producing more per acre than anything she could have imagined when she was standing at the fence line watching a bulldozer and trying to keep her coffee warm. My father understood what this land could do, she said. He wrote it down and I put the notebook on a shelf, and someone spent years trying to make sure the land would never do it. And the thing they used to bury the land. That's what we made the soil from. She paused. Not because we were clever, because the biology works that way. Destruction and creation are not opposites in soil science. Usually one makes the other possible, if you're patient enough to let it. Bree kept the camera running after Nora stopped, gave the silence its space. Then she asked, quietly, what do you want people to take from this story? Nora thought about the right answer. The true one, not the one that would make the best quote. That patience is a strategy, she said finally, not a compromise, not giving up and waiting. Active, specific, informed patience, knowing what you're waiting for and why and doing the work every day while you wait. That's not passive. That's probably the hardest kind of work there is. The film aired on PBS in the fall of 2018. It won a regional journalism award, and it produced something Nora hadn't anticipated. A wave of correspondence from farmers and soil scientists and extension agents across the Mid-South who'd been doing similar things in isolation, in their own counties on their own land with their own versions of a dead relative's knowledge, and who hadn't known anyone else was doing it. Letters, mostly. Some emails. A few phone calls from people who'd gotten the number from somewhere. She answered all of them. Sutherland's sawmill closed in February of 2020, not dramatically, not with a sudden announcement or a bankruptcy filing or any of the punctuation marks that stories use to signal significant endings. The operation simply wound down, orders completed, equipment idled, the last loads of material processed and the building locked. He'd sold the timber rights on his back acreage in Thofol to raise operating capital, and the sale had made clear to everyone, including him, that he was in the process of concluding, rather than continuing. The compliance costs from the environmental review had been significant. The market had not recovered. The math had finally run out. Nora heard about it from Vera Dunstan, who'd been told by someone at the post office, which was how news traveled in Harmon County when it was moving faster than the newspaper could print. She was standing in the kitchen when she heard. She set down the dish she was drying and looked out the window at the east field, covered in the good winter mulch she put down every year now, to protect the soil through the cold months. The field that had been a burial ground, that she'd rebuilt one wheelbarrow at a time, alone in the cold, with her father's shovel and her father's notebook and nothing else except the stubborn refusal to let a man who thought she was a problem turn out to be right. She thought about what she felt. It was not triumph. She'd examined herself carefully about that over the years. Whether what she was doing was revenge and whether she wanted it to be, and whether she'd be a different person if it was. She'd concluded honestly that it wasn't, that she'd been genuinely indifferent to his failure, and genuinely invested in her own success, and that the distinction mattered even when no one else could see it. What she felt was something quieter, the sensation of a thing held in tension for a long time finally being allowed to rest. She picked up the dish, finished drying it, put it away. Then she called Cliff. The property went to auction in April. 15 acres with an existing structure. The original processing building, still solid despite years of hard use, with high ceilings and concrete floors, and a loading dock that Nora had been thinking about since the week she heard the mill had closed. The auction was handled by a regional commercial real estate firm and was attended by 3 parties. A developer from Fayetteville who wanted the land for a storage facility, a timber investment company that wanted the acreage for replanting, and Nora Calloway, with Cliff Oaks beside her, and a letter of commitment from a regional agricultural development fund that Garrett had connected her to 2 years earlier, and that she'd spent those 2 years cultivating carefully. She'd been clear with the fund about what she needed and what she had, honest about the project and what the property would become and what the community use would look like. They'd done their due diligence, spoken to Walt and to Deirdre and to Garrett and to Bree, whose documentary had produced enough documented evidence of regional impact that the fund's board had approved the commitment in a single meeting. The developer dropped out at $140,000. The timber company stayed longer to $158,000. Nora bid $163,000, which was the ceiling of what the fund had committed and $3,000 more than she had any cushion for. She sat very still while the auctioneer went through the formalities. The timber company did not counter. Cliff touched her arm once. Briefly, when the gavel came down, she nodded, signed what needed to be signed, shook the hands that needed to be shaken. Then she drove home alone, because she'd asked Cliff not to come, and she'd asked Walt not to come, and she'd asked Lee, who had offered to fly down from Tulsa, not to come either. She needed to do this particular arrival by herself. She drove past her own property and turned into the Sutherland driveway. The driveway she'd watched dump trucks come and go from for 8 years. The driveway she'd never turned into before, and she parked in front of the building and got out. The morning was quiet. Early April. Before the heat had fully arrived, the air still carrying a trace of the winter it had just come from. A crow somewhere in the tree line. The creak from the south boundary audible if she was still enough to hear it. She was very still. She stood in the open space in front of the building and looked at what she'd acquired. Not with possession, with something more like responsibility, the feeling of having committed to a thing that was going to require everything she'd learned and then require her to learn more. The building was going to become a teaching center. Not elaborate. She had no interest in elaborate. Clean floors, good ventilation, demonstration beds outside, space for the Saturday sessions that had outgrown her own property, room for the university students who'd been coming in increasing numbers since the documentary aired. A place where the knowledge that had started in a brown leather notebook and been applied at a field over years of solitary work could live in the world properly. Not on a shelf. She stood there long enough to let it become real. Then she stepped inside and began looking at what would need to be done. Leigh called that evening from Tulsa. "How was it?" she said, quiet, a pause. "Good, I've been thinking." The particular quality of Leigh's voice when she was about to say something she'd been working up to. "I want to come back." Nora was quiet, not to visit, to stay. For a while, maybe longer than a while. Another pause. "I've been doing graphic design for food packaging for 6 years, and the whole time the thing I actually wanted to be doing was this. I didn't know how to say that until recently." Nora looked out the kitchen window at the east field in the dark. 12 acres of soil she'd built from garbage. The fence line where the dumping had happened, now just a fence line. The equipment shed where Thomas had died on a Tuesday in October, and where she'd kept working anyway, because what else was there to do? "There's a lot of work here," she said. "I know, more than I can do alone at my age. I know that too, and you'd have to learn the piles. Really learn them. Not from the document you made. From being in them every morning, I understand that." Nora was quiet for a moment longer. "Come in June," she said. "We'll see how it goes." Leigh came in June and she didn't leave. She came with her car packed with the things she'd decided mattered, and her laptop, and the particular compressed energy of a person who has made a decision and is ready to work. She didn't need a tour of the property. She went straight to the east field on her first morning, and stood at the edge of the compost beds and looked at them with an expression Nora recognized. The expression of someone who is about to start learning something the right way, which is from the beginning, with no shortcuts, with the full acknowledgement that they don't know yet what they need to know. "Show me pile 1, she said. Nora handed her a fork. They worked through that morning without talking much, which was also the right way. Leigh learning by doing, by feeling the resistance of the material against the tines, by watching how the interior steamed when it was opened, and what the color of the center told you about where the process was. By the end of the morning her boots were caked, and her arms ached, and she had the particular look of a person who has understood something in their body that they'd previously only understood in their head. "It's heavier than I expected," she said. "Everything real is heavier than you expect," Nora said. "That's how you know it's real." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Nora and Leigh in the field in the mornings. Leigh working on the teaching center documentation in the afternoons. Not just the single-page guide she'd made years ago, but a fuller record. Drawings and photographs and detailed notes on the seasonal variations Nora had observed over 8 years of managing the operation. A living document, designed to be added to, designed to be handed on. The teaching center opened in the fall of 2020, which was a difficult time to open anything, and also, in retrospect, exactly the right time. People were paying attention to land and food, and the fragility of supply chains in ways they hadn't been before, and a small composting teaching center in Harmon County, Arkansas, attracted more visitors than Nora had planned for. Extension offices from 3 states sent people. A university research program asked to establish a formal study site on the demonstration beds. 2 farmers from Missouri drove 6 hours because they'd seen the documentary and wanted to see the real thing. Nora walked them all through the same way she'd walked everyone through since Walt Brieger had first come with his thermos of coffee and his professional skepticism. Out to the piles, material in their hands, questions about their own land, and then she listened. By 2022, she was teaching 40 farmers regularly across 6 counties. and the network had developed the self-sustaining quality that genuine knowledge networks develop when the knowledge is useful enough. People were teaching each other, sharing results, calling each other about problems, building on what they'd learned in ways Nora hadn't directed and didn't need to direct. Walt had become a teacher in his own right, conducting his own Saturday sessions on his North section and sending people to Nora when their questions exceeded his current knowledge. The knowledge was moving, the way knowledge moves when it is genuinely alive. Vera Dunstan came to a session in the spring of 2023. Not as a visitor but as someone who'd been watching for a decade, and had finally decided she was ready to start. She was 76 years old, and she arrived with her own fork and the expression of a woman who intended to do this properly. Nora handed her the notebook without comment. Vera read the relevant sections, standing at the fence line, lips moving slightly. Then she put it down and picked up her fork and started turning. Nobody said anything about the bags of manure left at the gate over the years without notes. But Nora noticed Vera's hands on the fork. Careful, competent, already learning the weight of the material, and thought about the specific form of loyalty that asks for nothing and proves itself through decades of quiet action. The farm income had grown steadily. Not to wealth. She was still precise about that distinction, still the same person who'd sat across from Cliff Oaks in 2012, with $3,800 in savings, and understood what insufficient resources actually meant, but to a stability she hadn't felt since Thomas was alive. The premium produce, the institutional teaching partnerships, the occasional consulting work from people who'd seen the documentary or read Garrett's published study. All of it had accumulated into something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like enough. She had not stopped turning piles. This seemed important to her in a way she couldn't fully explain to people who asked. She could have delegated the physical maintenance. She could have moved into a supervisory role, an advisory role, the kind of role that comes with seniority and appropriate recognition, and no longer requires you to be outside in the cold before the sun comes up. No one would have thought less of her. But she thought the piles would have known. The biology doesn't care about seniority. It cares about attention. And the attention had to be sustained and personal and present in the way that reading a pile correctly requires. Not managed from a distance but felt under your hands, in the resistance of the material, in the temperature against your palm, in the smell that tells you something before you can name what it's telling you. Her father hadn't understood that. He'd been out in his garden until the last year of his life, hands in the soil, reading what was there. She was going to do the same. Have you ever held on to something everyone else said wasn't worth it, and been proven right? Not in a small way. In a way that changed what was possible for the people around you. Drop it in the comments. Because the thing nobody tells you about that kind of persistence is how alone it feels in the middle of it. How many mornings there are when the pile looks like a pile, and the cold is real, and the result is nowhere visible. How much it matters in those mornings to know that someone else has been in that exact middle place and kept going anyway. The spring mornings in the Ozarks come up slow and particular. The light takes its time. The birds go through their sequence. First the mockingbird, then the cardinals, then the ordinary chorus of everything else filling in around them. The creek along the south boundary catches the early color before the field does, the water holding light that the soil hasn't reached yet. Nora was in the east field on a morning in April of 2025 when Lee came out with 2 cups of coffee, and they stood together for a while without talking, the way people stand together when the talking is underneath the silence rather than in it. The field was doing what the field always did in spring. Coming up, the winter mulch decomposed into the surface, the planted sections showing the first true growth, the demonstration beds near the teaching center already ahead of where the calendar said they should be. 40 feet away, Walt Brieger was pulling in through the gate for the first Saturday session of the month. Vera Dunstan's truck was already parked along the fence. 3 people were coming from a county she hadn't worked with before. 2 university students were joining the regular participants. Lay handed her the coffee and looked at the field. "What do you think Grandpa would say?" she asked. Nora took the coffee, held it. Looked at 12 acres of dark, living, productive soil that had been a burial site, and was now the most fertile ground in the county. "He'd tell me to turn pile 3, she said. "And then he'd stand here and look at it for a while, the way he used to look at things that had turned out right. Not saying anything. Just looking." Lay was quiet for a moment. Then, "And Thomas?" She thought about him. The Tuesday in October and the 17 years before it, and the way he'd learned to read soil with her, even though he'd grown up in a city, and hadn't known anything about it when they married. The way he'd come in from the field with his boots caked and his face tired and completely content, in the way that people are content when they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Thomas would have found the whole thing very funny, she said, and then he would have found it very good. She finished the coffee, handed the cup back to Lee, bent down and picked up her father's fork from where she'd left it, leaning against the bed marker the evening before. The same fork, the same HS, stamped into the handle, the blade worn to the shape of decades of use. She pressed it into the surface of pile 3. The steam rose up around her hands in the cool April air. The smell reached her, that deep, complex, forest floor richness that she had first encountered in November of 2012. With her hand plunged into a garbage pile that she had chased and cultivated and taught and passed on through every year since. The smell of something alive, the smell of a process running correctly, doing what it was supposed to do, converting what it was given into what was needed. She turned the pile. Behind her, she heard the gate open and the sound of people arriving. Walt's voice, Vera's quieter acknowledgement, the unfamiliar voices of the people coming from the new county. In a few minutes, she would walk them out here and put material in their hands and ask them about their land. She would listen to what they'd observed. She would show them the notebook, her father's handwriting and her own additions alongside it. And now in the margins of the margins, Lee's notes from the past 5 years. 3 generations of people learning the same piece of ground in their own time. But right now she turned the pile. The biology was doing what biology does. Patient and persistent and entirely indifferent to everything except the work itself. Converting what it was given into something new, as it had been doing on this land since before anyone alive could remember. As it would continue doing long after the last person who remembered any of this was gone. You couldn't rush it. You couldn't buy it. You couldn't schedule it or outsource it or replicate it with a windrow turner and a consultant from Fort Smith. You could only show up every day with a fork and the willingness to read what was there rather than impose what you wanted to find. Her father had known that. He'd written it down in a brown notebook and carried it in his back pocket for 30 years. She'd put it on a shelf for 9 years and then taken it down on a night when she needed it, and it had been exactly what she needed, patient on the shelf, waiting for her to be ready. Now Lee was here. Now the knowledge was moving. Now the East Field was alive in a way it had never been, even in her father's best years. Because what was growing here wasn't just soil. It was the accumulated understanding of people who had paid attention to it across generations and who had insisted, against considerable pressure to do otherwise, that it was worth paying attention to. That was what soil teaches you, if you're willing to stand in it long enough to learn. That everything discarded can become valuable, that everything meant to bury you can become the ground you stand on. That some things, if you give them enough time and enough honest work, don't just recover. They become more than they were before. She kept turning. The morning kept brightening. The field kept doing what fields do when the soil is right, and the season is ready, and the people tending it understand what they have. It grew.